Vivian Kane had never considered herself the kind of woman who would open a stranger's package after midnight. She was an archivist by training and temperament, which meant she believed in provenance, in chain of custody, in the quiet holiness of leaving things exactly as they were found. But the night shift at the private document preservation lab changed a person's relationship with propriety. The lab occupied the basement level of a limestone building that had once been a bank vault, and the walls still held the cold patience of stored wealth. Vivian worked alone from 10 in the evening until 6 in the morning, cataloging materials for clients who paid handsomely for discretion. She had learned not to ask where the ledgers came from. She had also learned that the ones who paid the most were the ones who provided the fewest details. The sealed package arrived at 11:43 by courier service, wrapped in brown paper that felt slightly greasy to her fingertips. No return address. No client code. Just her name in block letters that someone had written with a ruler-straight hand. Vivian slit the tape with her bone folder and found a 19th-century journal bound in cracked leather, the spine held together by what looked like old medical tape. She turned the pages carefully, recognizing the handwriting as the same cramped cursive she had seen in 3 other ledgers over the past 2 months. Those had come through official channels, routed from a law firm representing an anonymous collector. This one had no such cover. The photograph fell out before she reached the middle of the journal. It was modern, glossy, completely out of place against the yellowed paper. A man's silhouette stood at a window, backlit by a street lamp, his face invisible. The window frame was ornate, probably a 19th-century townhouse. Vivian flipped the photograph over. Nothing written. She held it up to the overhead light, looking for watermarks or studio stamps, but found only the faint impression of a thumbprint on the corner. She did not recognize the shape of the man's shoulders, but something about the stillness of the pose made her think he knew he was being photographed and had chosen not to move. She returned to the journal. The first 50 pages contained shipping manifests for dry goods, boring and meticulous. But somewhere around page 62, the handwriting shifted. The same hand, but the language changed from English to a cipher she had seen exactly once before, in a 1920s diary belonging to a Prohibition-era accountant. That diary had been donated to a university archive by a descendant who claimed her great-grandfather was a grocer. Vivian had spent 3 evenings breaking the cipher out of sheer academic stubbornness. It was a simple substitution, but with a twist, the vowels shifted positions based on the day of the week. Whoever had designed it wanted the code to change without leaving a key behind. She worked through the next 2 hours without looking up. The cipher revealed financial records, but not for dry goods. These were city contracts, street repairs, bridge inspections, school construction bids, with numbers that did not match the public filings. A bid that was recorded as $40,000 in the journal had been awarded for $120,000 according to the city register. The difference of $80,000 was marked with a single symbol, a small, precise circle. Vivian had seen that symbol before, too. It had appeared in the margins of the other ledgers, always next to the largest discrepancies. Her hands began to tremble around 2 in the morning. Not from cold. The basement was climate-controlled to 62 degrees, but she had worn a wool cardigan. The trembling came from recognition. She was not cataloging historical curiosities. She was holding a record of embezzlement, bribery, and what looked suspiciously like money laundering, all of it dated within the last 4 years. The journal was not an antique. It was a prop, a deliberate anachronism meant to hide modern crimes inside old leather. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to make the records look like relics, probably to evade digital discovery. She reached for her work phone, the burner device the lab issued for after-hours client contact. The screen showed one saved number under the name Client 731. She had never met Client 731. She had spoken to him exactly 4 times, always at night, always in short, declarative sentences. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that belonged to a man who never repeated himself because he never had to. He answered on the first ring. "You opened the package," he said. Not a question. Vivian pressed the phone harder against her ear. "The journal isn't historical. The binding is distressed, but the paper is less than a decade old. And the cipher is active, it's tracking current city contracts." A pause. Then, "I know. Then why did you send it to me?" "Because you broke the first cipher in 3 days. My in-house analyst took 6 weeks. Vivian closed the journal and placed her palm flat on the cover. The leather felt warm now, or maybe that was her own heat. "Who are you?" "You work for Mr. Marchetti," he said, as if that answered everything. "The ledger you're holding is the last one. Finish it, and your debt is cleared in full. The debt. Vivian had almost managed to forget about it for 3 entire minutes. Her sister Lena's hospitalization 2 years ago had not been a simple emergency. It had been a cascade: surgery, complications, infection, a second surgery, rehabilitation that insurance classified as out-of-network despite the hospital being 15 minutes from Lena's apartment. Vivian had sold her car, drained her retirement account, and still come up short. The lab job had been a lifeline. The anonymous client had been a miracle. She had never asked where the money came from. She had told herself that archivists did not judge the provenance of their paychecks. What debt? She asked, though she knew exactly what he meant. The remaining $43,712. His voice did not change inflection. Consider it settled upon delivery of the decoded journal. The line went dead. Vivian sat in the basement vault with the journal under her hands and the photograph face down on the table. She did not cry. She had stopped crying over money 2 months into Lena's treatment, when she realized tears did not pay for ventilators or physical therapists or the kind of pain medication that kept her sister from screaming. Instead, she opened the journal to page 1 and began again, this time recording the deciphered text in a separate notebook with a mechanical pencil that would not smudge. She finished the first pass at 4 in the morning. The sun would not rise for another 3 hours, but the basement had no windows, so the light never changed. She sat back and pressed the heels of her hands against her eyes until she saw stars. The journal contained 18 separate contract manipulations, totaling just under $2 million in diverted public funds. The circle symbol appeared next to each one. She had no idea what it meant, but she knew it was a signature of some kind. Not a name. A brand. The photograph lay where she had left it. She picked it up again and studied the silhouette. The man at the window stood with his hands behind his back, a posture she associated with military officers and headmasters. His head was slightly tilted, as if he were listening to something outside the frame. She turned the photograph over once more, then slipped it into the journal's back cover and placed both inside the acid-free box she reserved for active projects. She locked the box in the fire safe, set the alarm, and walked up the basement stairs to the street-level door. The air outside was cold and smelled of wet concrete. A black car idled at the curb. Not a sedan, something larger, with tinted windows that reflected the streetlights in long, distorted streaks. No exhaust plume visible, no engine sound that she could detect. Just the low, patient hum of a vehicle that had been waiting for a while. Vivian did not approach it. She turned left and walked toward the subway, her flat silent on the pavement. The car did not follow. But when she glanced back at the corner, it was still there, and she had the distinct sense that the man behind the tinted glass was not watching the street. He was watching the distance between himself and her retreating back. Her apartment was a studio in a pre-war building with a buzzer that had not worked in 3 years. She climbed 4 flights of stairs because the elevator had been condemned by a city inspector who never came back to sign the paperwork. Inside, she locked both deadbolts and leaned against the door, letting the cold of the metal seep through her cardigan. The apartment smelled like old books and the lavender sachet Lena had given her for Christmas 2 years ago, the one Vivian kept in her sock drawer because she could not afford to replace it. She slept in her clothes. When she woke at 9 in the morning, sunlight was cutting across the floor in a single narrow stripe, and an envelope had been pushed under her door. Vivian did not remember hearing anyone approach. Her neighbors were heavy sleepers and the hallway carpet was thin, but she had trained herself to wake at the smallest creak. She picked up the envelope. Her name was written on the front in the same block letters as the package. Inside, a single sheet of plain white paper held 4 words, *UC patterns. I need you to see one more asterisk. Beneath the words, a receipt from the hospital. Lena's final bill. 0 balance due. Vivian sat on the floor with her back against the door and stared at the receipt for a long time. The paper was warm from being pressed against the hallway's radiator. She thought about calling Lena, then decided against it. Her sister was a detective with a suspicious mind and a protective streak that had nearly gotten her fired twice. Lena would ask questions Vivian did not know how to answer. Lena would tell her to go to the police. Lena did not know that Vivian had been decoding crime scenes for months, mistaking them for history. She ate a piece of toast standing over the sink. She drank water from a glass that said "World's Okayest Sister," a gift from Lena that was meant to be ironic and had become accidentally sincere. She washed her face with cold water and braided her hair without looking in the mirror because she did not want to see whether she looked like someone who had just sold her silence for $43,000. At noon, she called the number for client 731. I decoded the journal, she said. The cipher is consistent with the previous ledgers. The circle symbol appears 18 times, always linked to a contractor named Hawthorne Group. Mr. Marchetti will see you tonight, the voice replied. 7 o'clock. The address will be sent. I didn't agree to a meeting. You decoded the journal. Now you know what the circle means. A pause. That knowledge has a weight, Vivian. You can carry it alone, or you can hand it to the man who already owns it. The line went dead again. The address arrived by text message at 6:15. A private library in the old financial district, a street she had walked past 100 times without noticing the brass plaque beside the unmarked door. Vivian dressed in the most professional thing she owned, a black turtleneck, gray trousers, boots that had been resoled twice. She left her phone at home, then went back for it, then left it again. She took only her notebook and a single pencil. The door was unlocked. Inside, a narrow hallway led to a staircase carpeted in dark wool. No reception desk, no security guard, no visible cameras. Just the smell of old paper and beeswax, the same smell that clung to her own clothes after a night in the vault. She climbed the stairs and found herself in a room that might have been a library 2 centuries ago and still was, if the definition of library included 20-foot ceilings and shelves that required a rolling ladder. The door closed behind her. She did not hear the latch turn. She did not hear footsteps. But the air changed, became heavier, as if someone had stepped into the room and absorbed the oxygen. Vivian turned slowly, her hand still on the doorknob. Dante Marchetti was seated in a high-backed chair near the fireplace. The fire was not lit. He did not move when she looked at him, did not nod or speak or offer any of the small gestures that signaled recognition between strangers. He simply watched. His hands rested on the chair's arms, perfectly still. His eyes were the darkest brown she had ever seen, almost black in the dim light, and they did not blink when she met them. Vivian understood, in that moment, why the room had gone silent. Not because he had commanded it. Because silence was the only appropriate response to a man who looked at you as if he had already memorized every version of every choice you might make. She did not run. She did not speak. She stood in the closed doorway of a stranger's library with a dead woman's debt and a living woman's fear tangled in her chest, and she waited for him to say the first word. He did not say anything for a full minute. Then he leaned forward slightly, just enough to show that he could, and the silence became a thing with teeth. Vivian did not speak first because she had learned long ago that silence was a tool, not an absence. In the archive, silence meant preservation. In her apartment, silence meant survival. Here, in this library with a man who had not yet introduced himself, silence meant she would not give him the satisfaction of her nerves. Dante Marchetti broke first. Not with words. He simply shifted his weight in the chair, crossing one ankle over the opposite knee, and the movement carried the weight of a man who had never needed to rush. Then he spoke. "You're not afraid?" It was not a question. Vivian kept her hand on the doorknob. "I'm terrified. But fear and stupidity are different things, and I'm not stupid enough to show you which one I'm feeling." His mouth did not smile, but something behind his eyes shifted. Approval, perhaps. Or curiosity. She could not tell, and she suspected he wanted it that way. He gestured to the chair across from him, a smaller thing with worn leather and a straight back. She did not sit. He did not insist. He explained the proposition in 4 flat sentences. 7 remaining ledgers, all in the same cipher, all tied to the same circle symbol. Her job was to decode them and identify the pattern linking the names, dates, and contractors. His job was to erase every trace of her sister's medical debt and destroy the record showing Vivian had handled laundered documents. He said laundered the way another man might say misfiled. Vivian asked what happened if she refused. Dante looked at the window behind her, the one that faced the street, and said nothing for so long that she thought he had finished the conversation. Then he returned his gaze to her face. "Then you walk out that door and live with the knowledge of what you saw. But knowledge has a way of finding company." She walked out. She walked down the carpeted stairs, through the unmarked door, and onto the sidewalk, and she kept walking until her calves burned and her breath came in shallow gasps. She made it 3 blocks before she realized she was crying. Not from fear. From exhaustion. The kind of tired that lived in the marrow. The next morning, Roman Shaw appeared at her apartment door. She had never seen him before, but she knew immediately who he worked for. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, the same posture as the silhouette in the photograph. He held a ledger bound in brown leather, the spine uncracked. He did not step inside. He simply placed the ledger on the floor of the hallway and said, "He doesn't ask twice." Then he left. Vivian stood in her doorway for a full minute before picking up the ledger. The cover was warm from being carried. She opened it to the first page and saw the cipher staring back at her, patient and hungry. She worked that night in Dante's study instead of the lab. Roman drove her in the same black car, and she sat in the back seat with her hands folded in her lap, watching the streetlights slide across the windows. The study was smaller than the library, more personal. A desk that had been scratched by decades of use. A bookshelf filled with law texts and worn paperbacks. A single photograph of an older man with the same dark eyes, tucked behind a paperweight. Dante sat in a chair by the window, reading a file. He did not hover. He did not check her work. He read for 3 hours without looking up, and Vivian found herself relaxing into the rhythm of transcription. The cipher gave way beneath her pencil. Names emerged. Dates. Dollar amounts. The circle appeared 14 times in the first 50 pages. On the third night, she paused at a name she recognized. A former city official who had resigned suddenly, citing family reasons. The ledger showed a payment of $200,000 to a shell company, dated 3 days before the resignation. The circle sat beside the entry like a signature. She looked up. Dante was watching her. Not staring, simply present, his attention resting on her like a hand on a shoulder. She asked who the circle represented. He said, "My father's killer." The words landed in the space between them and stayed there. Vivian did not ask for details. She returned to the ledger, but her hand trembled slightly as she turned the pages. Not from fear. From the weight of holding something that had broken another person's life. On the 5th night, she finished the 7th ledger. She placed her pencil on the desk and sat back. Dante rose from his chair and walked to the desk, standing close enough that she could smell wool and old paper. He looked at her work, page by page, without touching anything. Then he said, "No one has seen that in 10 years. Vivian looked up at him. His face was still, but his hands were not. His fingers pressed against the edge of the desk, white at the knuckles. She understood then that he was not a monster enjoying a game. He was a man who had been waiting a decade for someone to help him bury his father properly, and he had found her by accident, and he did not know what to do with that. She said, "You could have hired anyone. Why me?" He did not answer. But he also did not step away from the desk. They stayed like that for a long moment, his hands pressing into the wood, her hands resting on the ledger she had just decoded, and the silence between them was no longer a weapon. It was a room they were both choosing to stay inside. The next morning, Lena called. Vivian answered on the second ring, still in bed, still wearing yesterday's clothes. Lena's voice was tight and low, the voice she used when she was trying not to be angry at someone she loved. "Someone broke into the precinct last night. Took case files from my desk. Organized crime files, Vivian. The ones I've been building for 6 months." Vivian closed her eyes. The ceiling of her studio apartment stared back, cracked and water-stained. She thought of Dante's hands pressing into the desk. She thought of the circle beside his father's death. "Vivian," Lena said. "Are you listening? I'm here. Whoever did this knew exactly which files to take. They didn't touch anyone else's casework. Just mine. Just the syndicate files." Vivian sat up. The apartment was cold. The ledger from last night sat on her kitchen table, because she had been too tired to lock it in the safe. She looked at its brown cover and thought about Dante's face when he said his father's killer. She said, "You need to take a leave of absence." Lena laughed, sharp and wrong. "I need to find out who's inside my precinct. And I need you to be careful. Because if they came for my files, they know about you too." The line went dead. Vivian sat on the edge of her bed, holding the phone against her chest. She did not call Dante. She did not need to. She already knew he had taken the files. She also knew he had not done it to hurt Lena. He had done it to protect himself. And somewhere in the space between those two truths, Vivian realized she was no longer afraid of him. She was afraid of what she was willing to overlook. Dante did not apologize for taking Lena's files. He stood by the window of his study, backlit by a cloudy afternoon, and explained the situation as if discussing a contract dispute. The mole inside his organization had been feeding information to a rival faction for 8 months. Lena's investigation had accidentally aligned with the mole's leaks, which meant her case files contained evidence that could destroy Dante's entire operation. He had removed the files to buy time. Nothing more. Vivian sat in the chair across from his desk, her arms crossed. "You stole from a police precinct. My sister's precinct. I borrowed, Dante said. Your sister is thorough. That's dangerous. She wanted to throw something at him. Instead, she asked what he wanted from her. He turned from the window and looked at her with the same unreadable stillness she had learned to recognize as his version of vulnerability. Find the mole. You see patterns in the ledgers. The same patterns exist in my organization's movements. Shipments that were intercepted. Meetings that were compromised. A traitor leaves a signature, just like the circle. Vivian shook her head. I'm an archivist. Not a spy. You're a woman who decoded 7 ledgers in 5 nights and never once asked for more money. He walked to the desk and placed a thick folder in front of her. You're exactly what I need. She opened the folder. Inside were shipping manifests, meeting schedules, and a list of names she did not recognize. The dates spanned the last 10 months. Beside each entry, someone had written a small notation in red ink. Vivian touched the first notation with her fingertip. It was a date format she had seen before, in the ledgers. The mole was using the same cipher. Her stomach turned cold. The mole is someone who worked with your father. Dante said nothing. That was confirmation enough. She agreed to help on one condition: Dante would personally ensure Lena was reassigned to a desk job, far from organized crime investigations. He gave his word. Roman, who had been standing silently by the door, made a small sound that Vivian later understood was surprise. Roman had never heard Dante give his word before. The pattern emerged on the 3rd night. Vivian spread the manifests across Dante's desk and traced the red notations backward through time. The mole always struck before a major shipment, never after. That meant access to advance schedules. Only 5 people had that access. Dante's cousin was one of them. She did not say the name aloud. She wrote it on a piece of paper and slid it across the desk. Dante read it. His face did not change, but his hand curled into a fist on the armrest of his chair. The cousin had been raised beside him. They had learned to swim in the same lake. They had buried Dante's father in the same rain. Dante stood up and walked to the window. He stood there for a long time, his back to her. Vivian watched his shoulders rise and fall with each breath. She did not offer comfort. She did not know how. He finally spoke without turning around. The charity gala. Tomorrow night. The mole will be there, because the guest list includes every city official who has ever taken a payment from my family. He paused. Your sister will be there too. Undercover. Vivian rose from her chair. You said you would protect her. I said I would reassign her. She refused the desk job this morning. Dante turned. His face was gray with exhaustion. She's been tracking me for 6 months, Vivian. She doesn't know she's walking into a room full of people who would kill her without hesitation. The gala was held in a hotel ballroom with chandeliers the size of small cars. Vivian wore a black dress that Roman had left on her bed that morning, no note attached. She did not ask where it came from. She pinned the wire to the inside of the dress's seam, exactly where Dante had instructed, and she walked through the hotel's revolving doors with her hands steady and her heart pounding against her ribs. She found Lena near the bar, wearing a silver dress and a fake smile. Vivian approached carefully, pretending to be a guest who had lost her table. Lena's eyes widened for half a second before the mask returned. You shouldn't be here, Lena whispered. Neither should you. A politician cornered Vivian before she could say more. He recognized her from the archive, had used the lab once for a family Bible restoration. He asked what she was doing at a charity event. She opened her mouth to lie, but no words came out. Then Dante was there. She did not see him approach. She only felt his hand press against the small of her back, firm and deliberate, and the politician's smile faltered. Dante introduced Vivian as his guest. The politician excused himself within seconds. Dante leaned down, his mouth close to her ear. You're safe. But don't mistake safety for freedom. She turned her head. His face was inches from hers. She could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the faint scar along his jaw. She asked why he trusted her. He said it was because she had looked at his father's ledgers and seen grief instead of greed. That night, after the gala ended and Lena had been escorted home by a uniformed officer Vivian did not recognize, Dante sat in his study with the folder spread before him. Vivian sat across from him. She pointed to the cousin's name on the list of 5. It's him, she said. The date notations match the cipher exactly. He's been leaking your routes for 11 months. Dante closed the folder. His hands did not tremble. His voice did not break. But when he stood up and walked toward the door, he paused beside her chair and placed his hand on the back of it, not touching her, just close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his fingers. "Thank you," he said. Then he left. Vivian sat alone in the study for a long time. The photograph of Dante's father watched her from behind the paperweight. She thought about the cousin, about loyalty and blood and the difference between the two. She thought about Lena in her silver dress, smiling at men who would have killed her for looking too long at their ledgers. She thought about Dante's hand on the back of her chair, and how she had wanted him to leave it there. She gathered her coat and walked to the door. Roman was waiting in the hallway. He did not ask if she was ready to leave. He simply opened the front door and let her walk into the cold night air, alone. The cousin did not go quietly. Dante confronted him in a warehouse on the waterfront, and the cousin admitted everything: the leaks, the money, the decade of resentment festering under the surface of family dinners. But he did not beg for mercy. He laughed instead, and he told Dante that killing him would not bring their father back. Dante walked out of the warehouse with his hands empty. The cousin walked out behind him, alive but exiled. Roman later told Vivian that Dante had not said a single word during the entire hour inside. The rival faction saw the cousin's survival as weakness. Within 48 hours, 2 of Dante's shipping routes were hit. A warehouse burned. 3 men were hospitalized. Roman took a bullet in the shoulder during an ambush that should have killed him, and Vivian learned about it from a news alert on her phone because Dante did not call. She went to the hospital anyway. Roman was awake when she arrived, sitting up in bed with his arm in a sling, and he looked at her with something close to pity. "He sent you away," Roman said. "For your own safety." Vivian stood in the doorway of the hospital room. "He didn't send me anywhere. He stopped talking to me." Roman closed his eyes. "That's the same thing." She did not see Dante for 6 days. The ledgers stopped arriving. The black car stopped idling outside her apartment. She returned to the lab and cataloged 19th-century shipping records for a university client, and she told herself she was relieved. The silence was a return to normal. The silence meant she was no longer complicit. The silence meant she could sleep through the night without dreaming about a man who had once sat on the floor outside her door until dawn. But the silence was not empty. It was full of questions she could not answer. Why had he trusted her with his father's ledgers but not with his fear? Why had he held the back of her chair like he was holding himself back from something worse? Why had she waited 6 days for a phone call she knew would never come? On the 7th night, she went to the library. The unmarked door was locked. She pressed the buzzer 3 times before Roman appeared, his arm still in the sling, his face pale from pain he refused to acknowledge. He told her Dante was not receiving visitors. She asked if Dante was dying. Roman said no. She asked if Dante was hiding. Roman said nothing, which was the same as yes. She pushed past him and climbed the stairs. The study was dark except for a single lamp on the desk. Dante sat in the chair by the window, the same chair where he had read files while she decoded ledgers. He did not look at her when she entered. He was holding a photograph, the same one that had fallen out of the journal on the first night. The silhouette at the window. His father. Vivian sat on the floor across from him. Not in the chair. On the floor, her back against the bookshelf, her knees drawn up to her chest. She stayed there for a long time without speaking. The clock on the desk ticked. The building settled around them. Dante's breathing was shallow and deliberate, like a man trying to hold himself together with air. He finally spoke without raising his head. "You should have run when I gave you the chance." "You never gave me a chance," Vivian said. "You gave me a ledger and a debt and a photograph of a dead man. That's not a choice. That's a cage with a view." Dante looked at her then. His eyes were red at the edges, not from crying but from sleeplessness. He looked older than she remembered. Smaller, somehow, though he took up the same amount of space. He said he was afraid. Not of the rival faction or the police or the cousin who had betrayed him. He was afraid of what he would become if someone used her to hurt him. He had never had something he could not replace. Until her. Vivian did not move from the floor. She said, "You don't get to decide what I'm worth to myself." He set the photograph on the windowsill. Then he slid off the chair and sat on the floor across from her, his back against the wall, his knees almost touching hers. They stayed like that for an hour, maybe longer. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them reached out. But the space between them shrank to the width of a held breath, and Vivian understood that this was the most intimate thing Dante Marchetti had ever done. He had let her see him when he had nothing left to hide behind. Her phone buzzed at 2 in the morning. "Lena." Vivian answered in a whisper. Lena's voice was low and fast, the voice she used when she was afraid to be overheard. The federal task force is moving in 48 hours. They have enough to take him down, Vivian. RICO, money laundering, conspiracy. If you're with him when it happens, you go down too. Vivian looked at Dante. He was watching her, his face unreadable again, the mask back in place. She knew he had heard Lena's voice in the quiet room. She knew he was waiting to see what she would do. Lena said, "I've arranged an extraction. Tomorrow night. Midnight. A car will be waiting at the corner of your street. No bags. No phone. Just you." The line went dead. Vivian lowered the phone to her lap. Dante had not moved. His hands rested on his knees, palms up, empty. She thought about the cousin laughing in the warehouse. She thought about Roman's shoulder, the bullet that had missed his heart by 2 inches. She thought about the circle beside Dante's father's death, and how she had decoded it without ever being asked to believe it. She said, "Did you ever plan to let me go?" Dante looked at her for a long, silent moment. The clock on the desk ticked. The building settled again. The space between their knees was a thread, a breath, a door left open. He said, "No." Vivian nodded. She did not stand up. She did not leave. She set her phone on the floor between them and let the silence return. But this time, the silence did not feel like a cage. It felt like a decision she had already made, waiting for her to catch up. Vivian did not get into Lena's car at midnight. She stood at her window and watched it wait at the corner for 15 minutes before it drove away without her. Then she walked to Dante's library for the last time, not because he had summoned her, but because she had finally stopped waiting to be asked. She found him dismantling his own organization. Not with violence. With paper. He had spent the night pulling every file, every ledger, every photograph that could be used as evidence against his people. He was not destroying them. He was sorting them into 3 piles, one for the federal task force, one for Lena's precinct, and one for the fire. Vivian sat beside him on the floor. She did not ask what he was doing. She picked up a stack of documents and began sorting. He did not thank her. He simply handed her the next pile. They worked until dawn. When the last file was sorted, Dante stood up and walked to the window. The sun was rising over the old financial district, pale and cold. He said he would testify in a closed hearing. He would name names, surrender his remaining holdings, and accept whatever sentence the court gave him. In return, Lena's career would be cleared. The federal task force would get their conviction. The city contracts would be investigated. Vivian asked what would be left of him. He said, "A small apartment above the archive. No guards. No empire. Just me." She stayed. Not because he asked. Because she had decoded his father's ledgers and sat on his floor and watched him choose exile over murder, and she knew now that the silence between them had never been empty. It had been full of every word he could not say and every one she had been afraid to hear. The hearing lasted 3 days. Dante testified without flinching. The cousin was arrested. The rival faction collapsed. Lena received a commendation and a promotion she did not want. Vivian returned to the archive and cataloged shipping records for clients who paid on time and asked no questions. 6 months later, she was locking the lab for the night when she saw a familiar silhouette in the doorway. Dante held a single ledger in his hands. Not one of the old ones. A new one, blank except for the first page. He said he had nothing left to hide and nothing left to lose, but he had one question he had never asked. Vivian took the ledger from his hands. She opened it to the first page. She wrote, "Debt, none. Reason, he chose silence. She chose to stay." She handed it back to him. He read the words. For the first time since she had met him, Dante Marchetti smiled. It was small and uncertain and entirely human. The room did not go silent when he walked in. It had been silent since the day she first saw him watching. She simply had not known, until now, that silence could feel like home. The end. If you want more stories of dangerous men, quiet women, and the silences that bind them, subscribe to stay updated. New chapters and full-length dark romance novels are coming soon. Don't miss the next fall into the dark.